1976, three companies were racing to get a personal computer to the market. And what was released in 1977, history will remember as the Trinity. The companies were Commodore, Apple, and Tandy Radio Shack, and the products were the Commodore PET, the Apple II, and the TRS-80 Model 1. But I'm going to focus on the one I arguably consider the most important during a critical time in computer history. But first, let's go back to 1976 and find out a little more about all three. First, Commodore. Founder of the Commodore International Company, Jack Tramiel, was convinced to enter the burgeoning microcomputer market after a very successful run of creating calculators. Initially, Commodore considered purchasing an existing design, and in September of 1976 got a demonstration of the Apple II by Jobs and Wozniak. But they considered Jobs' offer just too expensive. And so, Commodore, deciding to go with their own design, announced their upcoming computer in mid-76 and released the Commodore PET at the Consumer Electronics Show in January of 1977, making it the first of the three to hit the market. It contained Commodore BASIC and ROM, 4 8K of RAM, a keyboard, a monochrome monitor, and an integrated cassette. And it was a top seller in the Canadian and US educational markets. I myself used this first model in school as a kid, and the first company to license Microsoft BASIC, which almost caused Microsoft to file bankruptcy when the contract stated that they would only pay Microsoft when the PET shipped. And that shipment was delayed until December of '77. The only thing that saved Microsoft was that at the last minute, Apple decided that they would license Microsoft software for the Apple II. Although moderately successful outside of the educational realm, there was a couple of problems that kept it from knocking it out of the park for home or small business use. First, the integrated cassette left very little room for the keyboard. And that keyboard was a sight to behold. It was little more than an oversized calculator-type keyboard, and it was designated a chiclet keyboard. On top of it, the keycaps rubbed off easily after limited use. And if you're a computer history buff like I am, you'll know that in the late 70s through the 80s, a bad keyboard was always a sticking point for sales. And especially a keyboard like this was one of the worst. Correcting that keyboard problem, the PET was much more successful in its later iterations, but we're talking about 77 to 78. Next, we have the Apple II. After the success of the Apple I, Steve Wozniak designed the Apple II. It was introduced by Jobs and Wozniak at the West Coast Computer Fair in April of 1977, and it was their first computer aimed at the consumer market rather than the hobbyist. It did not come with a monitor or cassette player, but it did come with 4K of RAM, color graphics, cassette interface, game paddle support, sound and graphics commands in BASIC, with an external floppy available in 1978. Now I know the Apple II was an awesome computer, so much so that PC World in 2006 rated it the greatest PC of all time, and the Apple II would become wildly successful. After the Apple II became the Apple II Plus, the Apple IIe, C, C+, with the line finally being discontinued in November of 1993. But here's my caveat. Have you noticed something about these advertisements? Nowhere do you see a price. Or if there is, it's buried in the small type of the narrative. It was expensive, very expensive. It came out with a price of $1,298. That's $6,586 today. And if you bought it with the maximum 48K of memory, the price would shoot up to $2,638. In today's money, that's $13,366. And remember, that didn't include a monitor or any kind of cassette storage. I guess what I'm saying is that the Apple II was like a Corvette. Yes, a Corvette is awesome, but I know tons of people who never could afford a Corvette. And I'm talking about the importance of a computer that was successful early on, 77, 78, that got it in the most hands of people that would grow up to be designers and computer programmers. Which brings us to Radio Shack. VP of Manufacturing, John Roach, became interested in selling a microcomputer after a buyer, Don French, showed him his design. It wasn't what he was looking for, but after a meeting with a man named Steve Leninger, hired him, and he and French began working on a design. Radio Shack had millions of customers, but with the company's median selling price of a product at $30, a much more expensive computer was a huge risk. A lot of executives opposed the project. One even told French, "Don't waste my time, we can't sell computers." But because the sale of CBs were declining, which at one time was 20% of all sales, they were looking for new products, and approved the project with an emphasis on cost savings. For example, leaving out lowercase saved $1.50 per unit and reduced the retail price by $5. The first design had a mainbrain keyboard, but Leninger convinced Roach and French to include a better keyboard, a monitor, and a cassette recorder. In February of 1977, they showed the prototype to Charles Tandy, head of Tandy Corporation. It was a simple tax account program that promptly crashed because the program couldn't handle Tandy's entry of $150,000 for his salary. Software was upgraded. Leninger said he believed the company could sell 50,000 units, but no one believed him because they never sold that much of anything. Roach convinced Tandy to agree to build 3,500 units. That's one for each store so that the store could use it if it didn't sell. It was announced at a press conference on August 3, 1977. It was supposed to cost $399 or $599 with the monitor. 2 days later, much more publicity was had at Boston's Personal Computer Fair. Suddenly 15,000 people called to purchase, overloading their switchboard, with 250,000 on a waiting list for a down payment of $100, and they began shipping by September of 1977, and ended up selling over 100,000 units in 1978. Over 4 times the other two companies. The Model 1 specs were a monochrome monitor, a full-size keyboard housed in a breadbox-style shell. That looks familiar. A Z80 processor, 4K of RAM expandable to 16, 4K of ROM housing level 1 basic. There's no lower case and only cassette storage at the time. And a lot happened in 1978. Apple released their floppy disk system for $595 in July of '78. Radio Shack released the expansion interface for $299. It added space for memory to be increased to a total of 48K for the entire system, a floppy disk controller, a real-time clock, parallel port, and a compartment to add an optional RS-232 serial card. The Radio Shack floppy drive itself cost another $499. There was just no such thing as a cheap floppy drive back in 1978. So, let's find out what we had by the beginning of 1979. First, Commodore. Price, $795. In 1978, they upgraded their keyboard, which got rid of the cassette deck, but that was an entirely different computer. You couldn't upgrade the original. It was a solid metal case and there was nothing you could do with it. And they didn't release a floppy until 1979. Next, the Apple II. Price, $1298. It did not come with a monitor or a cassette deck. As a matter of fact, they didn't even make a monitor for the Apple II until 1983. They came out with the floppy in 1978, making the price for just the unit and the floppy drive at $1893. Lastly, we come to the TRS-80 Model 1. Price, $599. It came with a monitor and cassette, and with the added expansion interface at $299 and a floppy for $499, you would have the entire package including monitor for $1397. That's still $500 cheaper than the Apple II that had no monitor. One last thing. By 1979, Radio Shack amassed a large catalog of software, much larger than either Commodore or Apple at this point. Now I know, Other than the history which I just shared with you, the point of my video is basically an opinion. They were all great companies with awesome years and systems ahead for all three. But I think the Model 1, by peripherals and software, and a price allowing it to be in more hands, put it out front as we were about to hit the magical 80s. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.